Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the English Daily Book Summary YouTube channel. In order to not stop learning, listen to an English book summary every day for free.
Douglas Irwin, Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy. Few issues have divided American politics for as long, or as deeply, as trade. From the earliest days of the Republic, debates over tariffs, imports, and economic independence have shaped the country's political landscape. Trade policy has sparked regional conflicts, fueled party platforms, and reflected shifting ideas about America's role in the world. It's been used to fund the government, protect industry, punish rivals, and promote peace, often all at once. In this blink, you'll learn how trade policy evolved from a practical necessity in the 18th century to a deeply polarizing issue in the 21st. You'll see how economic interests, political power, and global events collided to shape decisions on tariffs and treaties, and you'll explore the long-running tension between protection and openness that continues to define how the U.S. approaches the world economy. To understand where it all began, we need to go back to the colonial era, when trade restrictions helped spark a revolution. Economic interests sparked American independence. One of the lesser-known triggers of the American Revolution was frustration over trade. In the 1760s and 70s, growing anger at British interference in colonial commerce sharpened demands for independence. The colonies relied on transatlantic trade to stay afloat, importing everything from cloth to tools and exporting crops like tobacco, wheat, and rice. But British trade laws like the Navigation Acts forced many goods through English ports, adding costs and reducing profits. For elite planters in Virginia and merchants in Boston, this inefficiency was deeply political. When Britain tried to tighten control and raise revenue after the 7 Years' War, imposing taxes on imports and trying to limit smuggling, resistance grew fast. Economic boycotts became a key weapon. Colonists cut imports from Britain, hoping that a drop in trade would pressure Parliament to repeal unpopular laws. These tactics had some success, and by the early 1770s, many Americans believed they could influence British policy through commercial pressure. But they also overestimated their leverage. When Britain refused to back down, calls for independence intensified. After declaring independence in 1776, the new nation expected to benefit from unrestricted global trade. But the war upended those expectations. The British blockade strangled commerce, major ports were occupied, and exports collapsed. Even after the war ended, the picture didn't improve much. Britain shut American ships out of the West Indies, and Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, had no power to respond. Individual states tried to retaliate, but their efforts were undermined by a lack of coordination and shared interests. The South feared giving Congress control over commerce, worried that it would favor northern shipping over southern agriculture. This post-war trade chaos helped drive support for a new constitution. The 1787 convention gave Congress full power to regulate foreign commerce and raise revenue through tariffs, solving a key weakness of the old system. In the new government, trade policy became a central function and a recurring battleground. As you'll see in the next section, the early republic relied heavily on tariffs not just to manage commerce, but to fund the government itself. Tariffs became the backbone of the early U.S. government. When the United States ratified its Constitution in 1788, it had no income tax, no central bank, and barely any federal infrastructure. What it did have was the power to tax imports, and that quickly became the foundation of its finances. By the early 1790s, tariffs on foreign goods were covering nearly all federal expenses, from paying war debts to funding the military. Unlike direct taxes, which were unpopular and hard to enforce, import duties were easier to collect and politically less risky. Ships arrived at a few major ports, and customs officers could tax their cargo right at the docks. But tariffs weren't just about raising money. From the beginning, they sparked debate about the government's role in shaping the economy. Some lawmakers saw tariffs as a way to support domestic manufacturing by making imported goods more expensive. Others feared this would hurt consumers and spark trade retaliation. Still, many agreed that tariffs were the most dependable revenue source the country had. By 1792, Congress had raised duties across the board, with average rates on dutiable goods approaching 20%. Officially, these hikes were for revenue, but they clearly gave a boost to domestic producers. That divide between protection and open trade began to fall along regional lines. Industrializing northern states tended to support higher duties. Southern states, more reliant on exports and imported goods, pushed back. Trade policy was no longer just an economic question. It reflected competing regional interests in political power. For several decades, the focus remained on revenue, but the balance gradually shifted. The War of 1812 disrupted trade and encouraged domestic industry, leading northern manufacturers to demand protective tariffs. In 1816, Congress passed the first tariff aimed partly at protection. Tensions grew, and in 1828, Congress passed what critics called the Tariff of Abominations, an especially high and wide-reaching tariff. Southern leaders protested fiercely, with South Carolina threatening nullification. A compromise eased the crisis, but high tariffs became politically entrenched. By the 1850s, the idea of using trade policy to protect industry was firmly established. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, it didn't start the protectionist era, but it locked it in. A new phase of American trade policy was already taking shape. Protectionism defined an era of American trade policy. In 1861, the average U.S. tariff rate on dutiable imports was already high by global standards. By the end of the Civil War, it had jumped even higher, and unlike wartime taxes, it never came back down. For nearly 70 years after the war, tariffs became a defining feature of American economic policy. What had started as a financial necessity in the early republic hardened into a political doctrine. Protectionism, the use of tariffs to shield domestic industries from foreign competition, wasn't just tolerated, it was actively championed, especially by the Republican Party, which held power for much of this period and drew its base from the industrial North. The argument was straightforward. Shielding American manufacturers from foreign competition would help develop national industry and provide jobs. That pitch resonated especially in states with heavy industry, from Pennsylvania's steel mills to New England's textile towns. But it came at a cost. Southern and Western farmers, who relied on exporting crops and buying imported goods, saw high tariffs as a burden. They had to pay more for consumer products while receiving no direct benefit. This sectional divide over trade policy became one of the defining political conflicts of the late 19th century. Even reform-minded presidents found it difficult to change course. Grover Cleveland made tariff reduction a major issue in the 1880s, but efforts at reform were consistently watered down or blocked. Congress remained the key battleground, and members often prioritized local economic interests over national consensus. Tariff schedules were shaped less by long-term strategy than by compromise and log rolling. Deals cut to keep everyone's favorite industries protected, and when change did come, it was often temporary or reversed by the next administration. By the time of the Great Depression, protectionism reached a peak with the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. While it didn't cause the Depression, it certainly didn't help. As the country faced economic collapse and global instability, policymakers would soon rethink the entire direction of U.S. trade strategy and shift toward negotiation, not restriction, reshaping American trade policy in ways the protectionist era never imagined. The Great Depression marked a turning point in U.S. trade policy. When the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, it pushed import duties to their highest levels since the Civil War. It was meant to protect American farmers and manufacturers from the effects of the global downturn, but instead it deepened the crisis and triggered foreign retaliation. Within a few years, trade had collapsed, unemployment had soared, and confidence in protectionism was badly shaken. What followed was the beginning of an entirely new approach to policy. In 1934, Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, a landmark law that shifted the power to negotiate tariffs from Congress to the President. For the first time, U.S. trade policy moved away from unilateral protection and toward bilateral cooperation. The idea was simple. The U.S. would lower some of its duties in exchange for similar concessions from other countries. This reduced tariffs and began to reframe trade as a tool of diplomacy, not just economics. This shift reflected a broader political realignment. The Democratic Party, dominant during the New Deal era, took a more outward-looking view on trade. By contrast, protectionist arguments lost momentum as the country turned its attention to recovery and international cooperation. In 1947, the U.S. helped establish the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, a multilateral system that encouraged negotiated reductions in trade barriers and laid the groundwork for today's global trading system. By the early 1950s, average tariffs were a fraction of what they'd been just 2 decades earlier. The political dynamic had changed too. Trade agreements became central to America's foreign policy, especially in the context of post-war reconstruction and Cold War alliances. Opening markets abroad was no longer seen as a favor to exporters. It was part of a broader strategy to stabilize the world and assert U.S. leadership. For the first time in its history, the United States had embraced a trade policy rooted in reciprocity and global engagement. But even as new institutions and alliances took shape, new pressures were building at home, pressures that would begin to test that post-war consensus in the decades ahead. Bipartisan support sustained trade liberalization in the Cold War era. By the late 1940s, U.S. tariffs had fallen to levels not seen since the 19th century. But what's more striking is how little political backlash there was. For the first time in American history, reducing trade barriers had become a shared goal across party lines. The trauma of the Great Depression and World War II had reshaped views on international commerce. Trade wasn't just about economic efficiency anymore. It was part of a larger strategy to rebuild global stability, contain communism, and cement America's influence abroad. This new logic underpinned a decades-long bipartisan consensus. The U.S. continued to expand its commitments under GATT, holding successive negotiation rounds that gradually brought down tariffs. The president, backed by renewed trade promotion authority from Congress, led negotiations. And despite political shifts in Washington, support for liberal trade policy remained remarkably steady from Truman through Nixon. But this consensus had limits. As the U.S. opened its markets, it began to face serious competition, first from Western Europe and then from Japan. Sectors like steel, textiles, and automobiles came under increasing pressure. Rather than reversing liberalization, policymakers responded with targeted relief, quotas, safeguards, and temporary protections designed to ease adjustment without abandoning the broader trade agenda. These responses were meant to preserve political support at home while keeping the international system on track. At the same time, the shape of U.S. trade itself was changing. By the 1970s, intra-industry trade, exporting and importing similar types of manufactured goods, was becoming more common. And as production globalized, large multinational firms became key players in shaping trade preferences. Organized labor, once divided over trade, increasingly began to voice skepticism, especially as wages stagnated and factory jobs declined. By the end of the Cold War, the basic architecture of U.S. trade policy was still intact. Open markets, executive-led negotiations, and international cooperation through GATT. But the political pressures were mounting. As the U.S. moved toward deeper globalization in the 1990s, those pressures would erupt into open conflict, and trade would once again become a source of intense political division. Trade became a lightning rod in modern American politics. When the U.S. signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, in 1993, it was backed by both a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. That kind of bipartisan support had defined trade policy for decades. But behind the scenes, the political ground was already shifting. NAFTA passed by a narrower margin than previous trade deals, and opposition wasn't just coming from labor unions, it was starting to cut across party lines. As globalization accelerated in the 1990s, the old consensus began to crack. The end of the Cold War removed the geopolitical rationale that had helped sustain trade liberalization. Meanwhile, the global economy changed in ways few had predicted. The creation of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in 1995 brought new disputes over rules and enforcement. China's entry into the WTO in 2001 opened up vast new markets, but also exposed American workers to fierce competition. Entire industries were hollowed out, especially in manufacturing-heavy regions. While consumers benefited from cheaper goods, the economic dislocation hit hard in places with few alternatives. As economic anxiety grew, trade became a political target. Critics argued that trade agreements prioritized corporate interests and failed to protect workers. The early 2000s saw a rise in trade enforcement cases and a slowdown in new agreements. By the time the Trans-Pacific Partnership was proposed, opposition was loud and widespread, from both ends of the political spectrum. In 2016, candidates from both major parties broke with past orthodoxy, challenging the very idea that free trade was good for the country. Trade policy, once a dry, technocratic concern, turned into a symbolic battleground, a proxy for deeper anxieties about inequality, economic upheaval, and national identity. Where earlier trade debates had focused on tariff rates or specific industries, the new conflict was about what kind of economy Americans wanted and who it was supposed to serve. Over more than 2 centuries, U.S. trade policy evolved from a tool of national survival to a source of national controversy. What began as a practical means to raise revenue became one of the most divisive issues in American political life. And as political and economic challenges continue to evolve, the debate over trade is unlikely to fade anytime soon. The main takeaway of this blink to Clashing Over Commerce by Douglas Irwin is that U.S. trade policy has never followed a straight line. It's been shaped by shifting alliances, regional rivalries, global crises, and changing ideas about what America should be. What began as a way to fund a new government gradually became a battleground over industry, power, and national identity. From early tariff debates to modern disputes over globalization, trade has reflected deeper tensions in American political and economic life. Understanding that long history helps explain why trade remains one of the most politically charged issues in the country today. Okay, that's it for this blink. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. See you soon.